Ancient wars were not won by brute force alone. Long before modern weapons, defenders survived by using discipline, terrain, patience, and psychology. So in this video, I'm counting down the top 15 most incredible ancient defensive tactics. Starting with number 15, the phalanx formation of ancient Greece. One of the most influential defensive tactics in ancient warfare was the phalanx formation, developed by Greek city-states no later than the 7th century BCE. Now, this wasn't a single battle trick or a weapon, but a disciplined system of defense that reshaped how armies survived, advanced, and held ground for centuries. The phalanx was built around heavy infantry known as hoplites. Each soldier carried a large round shield called a hoplon, a spear usually between 2 to 3 meters long, and body armor that varied by period and wealth. The defining feature of the formation was how these shields were used collectively rather than individually. Each hoplite shield protected not only himself, but also the left side of the man beside him. When assembled tightly, the overlapping shields formed a continuous wall of bronze and wood. From a defensive standpoint, this was revolutionary. Instead of relying on individual skill or mobility, the phalanx relied on cohesion. A well-trained phalanx could absorb frontal attacks from infantry, withstand missile fire to a degree, and deny breakthroughs simply by maintaining its structure. The formation typically advanced slowly, maintaining alignment at all costs. Breaking formation was dangerous. If gaps opened up, the entire line could collapse. This made the phalanx inherently defensive in mindset, even when attacking. Success depended on holding the line, resisting panic, and maintaining pressure rather than pursuing fleeing enemies. The terrain, of course, played a critical role. Phalanxes performed best on flat open ground where alignment could be preserved. On uneven terrain, rivers, hills, or wooded areas, the formation became vulnerable. Ancient commanders were well aware of that limitation, and Greek armies often refused battle unless the terrain favored them, which itself was a defensive decision rooted in survival. One of the clearest examples of the phalanx's power comes from the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. While often remembered as an aggressive Greek charge, the success of the Athenians depended on maintaining a coherent shield wall under pressure from the Persian missile fire. The Persian infantry, lighter and less heavily armored, struggled to penetrate the Greek formation head-on. Over time, the phalanx evolved. The Macedonian version under Philip II and Alexander the Great used much longer spears called sarissas, extending the defensive reach of the formation even further. Now, importantly, the phalanx was not invincible. The Romans eventually exposed its weakness by using flexible formations that could exploit gaps and attack from the flanks. The phalanx was a defensive system suited to a very specific condition. It was not a universal solution. And while details like exact shield overlap do vary by period and source, the core concept of mutual protection is consistently supported. In purely defensive terms, the phalanx is one of the earliest and most successful examples of a formation-based survival. It turned individual soldiers into a single defensive structure, capable of withstanding force that could overwhelm them individually. You can still see its influence today in modern riot shields, crowd control formations, and military drills focused on unit cohesion rather than individual action. Number 14. Shield walls of Northern Europe and early medieval armies. The shield wall was one of the most widespread defensive tactics used across Northern Europe, from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. Employed by groups including the Anglo-Saxons, Norse warriors, and other Germanic peoples, the shield wall was simple in design but extremely effective when executed with discipline. At its core, the shield wall involved warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their shields to form a continuous barrier. These shields were typically round or oval and made of wood, reinforced with metal rims or bosses. Unlike later medieval plate armor, personal protection was limited, which made collective defense essential. Written sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as well as Norse sagas and later medieval accounts, repeatedly reference shield walls as the primary defensive posture in a battle. Archaeological finds, too, include shield bosses and grips that support the practical feasibility of overlapping shields in close formation. The strength of the shield wall lay in its ability to absorb impact. Enemy weapons struck the shields rather than bodies. Spears and swords could be deflected, and arrows were less likely to penetrate a layered wall of wood and iron, especially at oblique angles. While the shields were not arrow-proof in a modern sense, their effectiveness against missile fire is supported by experimental archaeology. Like the phalanx, the shield wall depended heavily on morale and cohesion. Once the line broke, individual fighters became exposed and vulnerable. Battles often developed into prolonged pushing matches, with each side attempting to wear down the other physically and psychologically. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 provides one of the most well-documented examples. The Anglo-Saxon army under Harold Godwinson formed a shield wall along a ridge. Contemporary accounts indicate that repeated Norman attacks failed to break the line for hours. Only when parts of the English formation were disrupted did the defensive system collapse. Now, it's important to note that some elements of medieval battle descriptions are colored by later interpretations. For example, the exact role of feigned retreats at Hastings is debated among historians. Where the accounts differ, modern scholarship acknowledges the uncertainties rather than asserting a single narrative. The shield wall was especially effective in defensive terrain. Hills, narrow passes, and ridgelines amplified its strength. And unlike professional standing armies, many shield wall formations consisted of part-time warriors or levies. This makes the tactic's effectiveness even more notable. The limitations of the shield wall were clear. It was vulnerable to flanking, missile saturation, and prolonged fatigue, and by the high medieval period, more flexible formations and heavier armor began to replace them. Still, the shield wall represents one of the most practical defensive adaptations in early warfare. From a tactical standpoint, it was not about winning decisively. It was about not losing. It bought time, absorbed the force, and turned chaotic violence into a controlled resistance. Number 13. Defensive moats and ditches. One of the oldest and most widespread defensive tactics in human history is the use of moats and ditches. These earthworks appear across cultures, continents, and the millennia, from early Neolithic settlements to medieval castles and fortified cities. Their success lies in their ability to slow, expose, and exhaust the attackers before the combat even began. At its simplest, a moat was a trench dug around a settlement, fort, or stronghold. Some were dry, others were filled with water, depending on geography and resources. Archaeological evidence shows that defensive ditches were already being used thousands of years before metal weapons became widespread. Neolithic sites in Europe, like causeway enclosures, often include concentric ditches that served as defensive purposes. In many cases, it's difficult to determine whether these early ditches were purely defensive, and historians acknowledge that some likely served multiple functions. By the Bronze and Iron Ages, though, the military role of ditches became much clearer. Hill forts across Britain and continental Europe frequently featured deep ditches paired with earthen ramparts. These forced attackers to descend into a confined space and then climb upward under the attack, dramatically reducing momentum and coordination. In the ancient Near East, moats were used to protect the major cities. Assyrian reliefs depict siege scenes, showing attackers struggling to cross ditches while under missile fire, and written records confirm that moats were a standard element of urban defense, especially for cities built on flat terrain. Water-filled moats became more common where rivers, lakes, or high water tables made them practical. However, it's important to note that not all moats were permanently filled with water. Many medieval moats were dry for much of the year and only flooded seasonally or during sieges. This distinction is sometimes misunderstood in popular portrayals, but from a defensive standpoint, they served several critical purposes. First, they prevented direct access to walls, making undermining and battering more difficult. Second, they disrupted siege engines, which required level ground and stable footing. Third, they slowed the attackers, forcing them to cluster into exposed positions. Moats did also have a psychological effect. The physical separation created a boundary between safety and danger. Crossing it required commitment and courage. Under observation from all defenders, historical accounts frequently describe assaults stalling or failing at that stage alone. The limitations of moats, though, are well known. Determined attackers could fill the ditches with earth, debris, or anything else. Siege armies often spent weeks or months neutralizing a moat before attempting an assault. This doesn't diminish their defensive value, rather it highlights their role as time-buying tactics. Moats delayed the attack, increased logistical strain on the besiegers, and gave defenders opportunities to negotiate, reinforce, or even outlast their enemy. In purely factual terms, moats and ditches are one of the most reliable defensive tactics ever devised. They require no advanced technology, scaled to almost any environment, and worked regardless of the weapons used by attackers. Their effectiveness is supported by historical texts and battlefield logic. Number 12. Fortified high ground and hilltop defense. It's over, Anakin, I have the high ground. The use of high ground as a defensive tactic is one of the most universal principles in warfare, and its roots stretch deeply into prehistory, long before formal armies existed. Human groups recognized that elevation provided safety, visibility, and control. Across the ancient world, fortified high ground became a new foundational defensive strategy rather than a situational choice. In Europe, Iron Age hill forts dominated the ridgelines and elevated plateaus. In the ancient Mediterranean, acropolises served as both sacred centers and defensive refuges. In the Andes, high-altitude settlements used steep terrain as primary forms of protection. While the specific cultural context does vary, the defensive logic is consistent. Defenders could see the approaching threats from a distance, giving them time to prepare or avoid engagement. Attackers were forced to move uphill, slowing their advance and increasing their fatigue, and gravity worked in favor of the defenders, enhancing their effectiveness of thrown projectiles and missile weapons. Classical Greek and Roman sources repeatedly warn against attacking uphill unless it's necessary. Fortifying high ground amplified its defensive value. Walls, palisades, and ditches built on slopes required less material while offering greater resistance. Even relatively low walls became formidable when positioned at an elevation. Now, it's important to note that not all hilltop sites were purely military. Many served as permanent settlements or religious centers, and in some cases, defensive intent from social or symbolic importance is difficult. Archaeologists are cautious about making claims where physical evidence doesn't clearly indicate warfare. But from a tactical perspective, defending the high ground reduced the need for large numbers. Smaller forces could hold positions against much larger armies simply by controlling the access routes. Unlike specific weapons or formations, elevation never became obsolete. Its effectiveness doesn't depend on technology, training, or culture. It relies on unchanging physical realities, gravity, visibility, and human endurance. While details vary between the sites and cultures, the core defensive principle is universally accepted and supported by evidence. As a defensive tactic, fortified high ground is one of humanity's earliest and most enduring survival strategies. Number 11. Chevaux de frise and anti-advance obstacles. One of the most practical and used defensive tactics of the ancient world involved the deliberate placement of physical obstacles to slow, channel, or halt enemy movement. Among the best documented cases were those of chevaux de frise, rows of sharpened stakes or projecting elements designed to deny access and disrupt formation. The term chevaux de frise is modern and French, but the concept itself is ancient. Evidence shows that similar obstacle systems were used across Europe, the Near East, and Asia long before the Middle Ages. These defenses typically consisted of wooden stakes driven into the ground at angles, often sharpened or reinforced, sometimes hidden beneath vegetation or shallow soil. Iron Age hill forts in Britain provide some of the clearest evidence. Excavation at several sites have uncovered stake holes positioned in front of ramparts and gateways. Experimental archaeology has shown that these obstacles would have severely restricted movement, particularly for tightly packed infantry or cavalry. In Gaul, Julius Caesar describes the use of sharpened stakes during the Gallic Wars, particularly in defensive works constructed to protect camps and fortifications. His accounts describe obstacles designed to wound, entangle, or force attackers into a narrow approach route. And while Caesar's writings have to always be read critically due to their political purpose, archaeological evidence broadly supports his descriptions. The defensive value of these obstacles is in the simplicity of them. They require minimal resources, could be constructed quickly, and were effective against both infantry and mounted troops. An advancing force slowed by obstacles became vulnerable to missile fire and counterattacks. These systems were especially effective when combined with the terrain. Placed in front of ditches, at the base of slopes, or along narrow approaches, obstacles multiplied the difficulty of the attack. Now, it's important to clarify that not all ancient obstacles were designed to impale. Many were intended to simply disrupt formation and momentum. Falling, stumbling, or breaking alignment could be enough to expose attackers to lethal force. Their limitations were real and acknowledged even in the ancient contexts. They could be cleared, filled, or bypassed given time and manpower. Fire could destroy the wooden obstacles. However, like moats and ditches, their purpose was to delay rather than permanent denial. What makes it significant as a defensive tactic is their adaptability. They appear in permanent fortifications, temporary camps, and even battlefield preparations. They require no centralized authority or advanced engineering and makes them accessible to many societies. From a tactical perspective, they represent an early understanding of force multiplication. Rather than meeting attackers directly, defenders just reshape the environment to work against them. That principle is foundational in defensive planning even today. Number 10. Scorched Earth as a defensive strategy. Scorched Earth is one of the most severe defensive tactics used in ancient warfare. Unlike fortifications or formations, it involved deliberate destruction, burning crops, poisoning wells, and removing resources to deny an enemy sustenance and mobility. While often associated with later periods, evidence does show that Scorched Earth strategies were used in antiquity under specific circumstances. Ancient sources from multiple cultures describe this practice. Greek historians record instances where retreating forces destroyed supplies to prevent pursuit. In the Near East, Assyrian campaigns included systematic devastation of farmland as both punishment and strategic denial. It is important to distinguish scorched earth from indiscriminate destruction. In ancient contexts, it was typically a calculated response to invasion, used when defenders could not realistically hold territory through direct confrontation. By stripping the land of food and shelter, defenders aimed to slow or weaken the advancing armies that relied heavily on local foraging. Ancient armies did face severe logistical constraints. Large forces required enormous amounts of food, water, and fodder, much of which was obtained locally. Supply trains were limited and vulnerable, so Scorched Earth exploited that weakness. An army moving through devastated land faced starvation, disease, and loss of morale. This tactic was most often used during withdrawals or when facing overwhelming odds. Persian forces reportedly used land denial during retreats, and Greek city-states debated these measures when invasion was imminent. While specific decisions are sometimes only briefly described in a surviving text, the strategic logic here is consistent. Archaeologically, though, evidence for scorched earth can be difficult to interpret. Burn layers may result from many causes, including accidental fires or later conflicts. So as a result, scholars are cautious when attributing destruction solely to a defensive strategy. The human cost of scorched earth tactics was immense. It affected civilians as much as the invading armies, and ancient writers were not blind to that reality. Some sources criticize the tactic as morally harsh, even when acknowledging its effectiveness. The limitations of scorched earth were severe. It damaged the defender's own economy and population, and recovery could take years. Because of this, it was often controversial even in ancient decision-making. Unlike walls or formations, it offered no visible protection, only the promise that the enemy would suffer more over time. Where evidence is uncertain, though, historians refrain from firm conclusions, emphasizing the complexity of ancient warfare rather than simplifying it. Number 9. Layered city walls and defense in depth. One of the most effective ancient defensive tactics was the construction of layered city defenses, multiple walls, gates, and fallback positions designed to absorb attacks gradually, then rely on a single line of protection. This approach is often described today as defense in depth. It appears repeatedly across ancient civilizations and reflects a sophisticated understanding of siege warfare. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that many ancient cities were not protected by just one wall, but by a system of barriers. This could include outer walls, inner walls, towers, gate complexes, ditches, and elevated citadels. Each layer forced attackers to expend time, manpower, and resources before reaching the next. In the ancient Near East, cities like Babylon are well documented as having multiple concentric walls. Ancient descriptions, while sometimes exaggerated in scale, are supported by evidence showing successive defensive lines and controlled access points. Even if an attacker breached an outer wall, defenders were not immediately defeated. They could withdraw in an organized way to the inner defenses while continuing to resist. Gate systems were especially important. Rather than simple openings, ancient gates were often complex structures with narrow passages, sharp turns, and multiple doors. Excavations across the Levant and Mediterranean consistently reveal gated chambers designed to trap attackers in confined spaces. Towers integrated into walls served both offensive and defensive roles. Defensively, they provided elevated platforms for observation and missile fire. and remains show consistent spacing of the towers, suggesting an intentional coverage rather than a decorative design. This allowed the defenders to target attackers approaching walls or attempting to undermine them. Now, it's important to note that not all ancient cities used this defense in depth equally. Smaller settlements often relied on a single wall or natural barrier. In some cases, multiple walls may have served symbolic or administrative purposes alongside defense. Archaeologists are cautious when assigning purely military intent to all layers without corroborating evidence. And the limitations of these layered defenses are well documented. Maintaining multiple walls required labor, materials, and ongoing repair. If a city lacked sufficient defenders, the additional walls could become liabilities rather than assets. Still, though, the widespread recurrence of layered defenses across cultures suggests their effectiveness. Similar systems appear independently in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Indus Valley, China, and Mesoamerica. And while the cultural contexts differ, the underlying logic is consistent. From a defensive perspective, layered walls transformed cities into environments that favored endurance over a decisive battle. They allowed defenders to trade space for time, absorbing the pressure gradually rather than risking everything on a single barrier. Number 8. Controlled retreats and strategic withdrawal. Controlled retreat, sometimes called strategic withdrawal, is one of the most misunderstood defensive tactics of ancient warfare. Often mistaken for panic or defeat, it was, in documented cases, a deliberate and calculated decision designed to preserve forces, stretch the enemy resources, and reposition defenders under more favorable conditions. Ancient military text and historical accounts provide multiple examples of organized withdrawals. Greek historians describe armies abandoning open ground to retreat behind fortifications or into difficult terrain. Roman sources discuss tactical withdrawals used to avoid encirclement or unfavorable engagement. And while ancient writers sometimes framed retreat as dishonorable, their descriptions reveal a clear strategic intent. The defensive value of a controlled retreat lay in its preservation. Ancient armies could not easily replace trained soldiers. Losing a force in open battle could mean the end of a city or a state. Retreat allowed defenders to avoid catastrophic losses while maintaining the ability to resist later. Terrain played a critical role. Retreats were often directed towards hills, narrow passages, rivers, or fortified locations. Archaeological and topographical studies support that pattern. Routes of movement align with defensible landscapes rather than just a random flight. One common defensive use of retreat was to draw the attackers away from supply bases. Ancient armies depended heavily on foraging and short supply lines. By retreating gradually, the defenders could force the attackers deeper into hostile territory, increasing their logistical strain. Controlled retreats required discipline and command authority. Without coordination, withdrawal could quickly turn into a rout. Ancient sources emphasize the importance of maintaining formation, rear guards, and signaling during a retreat. Ancient historians often wrote with moral or political agendas. Sometimes they exaggerated the wisdom or folly of commanders, and as a result, modern scholars cross-reference texts with terrain analysis and evidence where possible. Where the risk of retreat was significant, retreating forces were vulnerable to pursuit, ambush, and loss of morale. If mismanaged, the retreat could destroy an army faster than a direct battle. Despite these risks, controlled retreat appears repeatedly in ancient warfare because it addresses a fundamental reality. Defense was not always about holding ground. Sometimes survival required yielding space temporarily to preserve your strength. It prioritized long-term survival over immediate pride or territorial control. In ancient warfare, where resources were finite and recovery was slow, this approach could determine whether a society endured or disappeared. Moving on to number 7, defense of choke points and narrow passes. One of the most consistently effective defensive tactics in ancient warfare was the deliberate use of choke points. These are locations where geography limited the movement of forces. Narrow mountain passes, bridges, river crossings, and coastal bottlenecks all allowed defenders to neutralize numerical disadvantages by forcing attackers into a confined space. Evidence, terrain analysis, and written sources all support the same principle. Where movement is restricted, defense becomes dramatically easier. Steep slopes, narrow paths, and limited maneuvering room prevented attackers from deploying formations or cavalry. Defenders could position themselves above or within the pass using elevation and constriction to their advantage. While the Battle of Thermopylae is the most famous example, numerous lesser-known engagements across Greece, Anatolia, and Central Asia followed the same logic. Bridges and river crossings were equally important. Ancient armies depended on predictable crossing points. Defenders could fortify or guard these locations, forcing the attackers either to attempt dangerous crossings under fire or to seek alternative routes. Forts and watchtowers are frequently found overlooking narrow passes and river fords. Their placement is rarely arbitrary. Visibility studies consistently show that these positions offered early warning and control over any movement corridor. Instead of defending an open perimeter, forces would concentrate manpower, weapons, and attention on a single approach. This made possible for smaller or less well-equipped forces to resist much larger enemies. Missile weapons were particularly effective in choke points. Archers, slingers, and javelin throwers could target densely packed attackers with reduced risk of return fire. It is important to acknowledge the limitations, though. Choke point defense depended on accurate intelligence and timing. If attackers discovered alternative routes, defenders could be bypassed entirely. Some ancient passes believed to be secure were outflanked through local guides or prior reconnaissance, and while sources describe such failures, historians generally accept them as realistic outcomes. Another limitation was supply. Defenders holding choke points could themselves become isolated if relief didn't arrive. Even the strongest position would eventually fall. Despite the risks, the repeated use of choke point defense across civilizations suggests its effectiveness. It required minimal construction, relied on natural features, and aligned with physical constraints on movement. While specific engagements are sometimes mythologized, the underlying principle is universally supported by archaeology and geography and common sense. Where ancient sources exaggerate the outcomes, modern historians focus on terrain reality rather than heroic narrative. Number 6. Counter-siege measures and defensive mining. As siege warfare became more sophisticated in the ancient world, defenders developed equally sophisticated counter-siege tactics. Among the most important of these were counter-mining, controlled sallies, and internal fortification response designed to neutralize siege engines and undermine attackers' efforts. One of the best documented counter-siege tactics is defensive mining, when attackers attempted to tunnel beneath city walls to collapse them. Defenders responded by digging counter-tunnels. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites confirm the use of this method. Tunnel systems beneath city walls show intersecting shafts consistent with both offensive and defensive digging. Once they were detected, a defender would dig towards the noise to intercept the tunnel, and in some cases this resulted in underground combat. In others, defenders collapsed enemy tunnels or filled them with smoke or water, and while descriptions vary, the core tactic is supported by the physical remains. Rather than waiting passively, defenders would launch sudden attacks from the gates or hidden exits to destroy siege engines, burn the supplies, or disrupt construction. Defenders also adapted their walls during sieges. Temporary internal ramparts, secondary barricades, and reinforced sections have been identified, and these measures have allowed defenders to respond dynamically rather than relying on original construction. Now, exact techniques used in the underground are difficult to reconstruct in detail. The wood supports would decay and many tunnels collapse over time, so as a result, archaeologists often identify mining activity without being able to attribute every feature confidently to attackers or defenders. But the effectiveness of these counter-siege tactics varied. Skilled attackers could still succeed, especially with superior manpower or time. However, countermeasures significantly increased the cost and duration of sieges. Rather than treating walls as a static barrier, defenders treated the city as a living defense system. Every attack method prompted a response, which created a cycle of action and reaction. Repeated setbacks, destroyed equipment, and failed tunnels undermined morale and extended supply requirements. As a defensive tactic, counter-siege warfare represents one of the clearest examples of ancient problem-solving under pressure. It shows that defenders were not merely waiting behind the walls, but actively shaping the outcome of a prolonged conflict. Number 5. Layered gate defenses and kill zones. In ancient warfare, gates were the most vulnerable part of any fortified settlement. Walls could be high and thick, but a gate had to open, close, and allow regular movement. As a result, ancient defenders developed increasingly sophisticated gate defense, designed not merely to block entry, but to trap attackers in a controlled space. Excavations across the ancient Near East, Greece, and the Levant consistently show that gates were rarely simple doorways. Instead, they were extended structures composed of multiple chambers, narrow passages, and sharp turns. This layout forced the attackers to slow down, bunch together, and lose formation while inside confined spaces. One of the most common designs was offset or bent axis entrances. Rather than allowing a straight run into the city, the gate forced people to turn sharply, often exposing their unshielded sides to defenders positioned above or alongside the passage. Defenders inside the gate towers could attack the attackers from above using stones, spears, or missiles. Evidence shows that gate towers were often taller and more robust than the surrounding sections, which reinforced the defensive role. Wear patterns on stone steps and floors also indicate repeated heavy use consistent with military activity. The concept of the kill zone is a modern term, but the functional reality existed in antiquity. Attackers who breached an outer gate often found themselves in a narrow courtyard or chamber where movement was restricted. Siege descriptions frequently mention attackers struggling at the gates even after breaking doors or rams succeeding. The fact that breaches didn't immediately result in a city collapse suggests that internal gate defenses were doing exactly what they were designed to do. But the limitations of layered gate defenses was pretty real. Determined attackers could still force entry if given enough time and resources, and once the defenders were overwhelmed or exhausted, gate complexes could become liabilities rather than an asset. However, their primary function was to delay, not invulnerability. As a defensive tactic, layered gate defenses represent one of the most deliberate and clearly evidenced attempts to shape enemy behavior through a built space. It's an understanding that survival depended not just on stopping the attackers, but on exhausting and disorganizing them before decisive combat. Number 4. Ambush from fortified positions. Ambush. It is often thought of as an offensive tactic, but in ancient warfare it was frequently used defensively, especially by forces protecting territory rather than seeking conquest. When combined with fortifications, terrain, and preparation, ambush became a powerful method of neutralizing attackers. Ancient sources across cultures describe defenders using hidden positions to strike advancing enemies unexpectedly. They were typically launched from behind walls, natural cover, or concealed routes near fortified areas. Archaeology and topographical evidence supports the plausibility of these tactics, particularly in rugged or forested regions. Fortified settlements often include hidden paths, posterns, or secondary exits. These features allowed defenders to move unseen and strike attackers engaged elsewhere. Ambushes were effective against supply lines. Ancient armies depended on foraging and supply convoys that were often lightly protected. Defenders could use knowledge of local terrain to attack these vulnerable elements, forcing the attackers to divert resources. Now, it's important to note that ambush required discipline and coordination. Poorly timed attacks could expose defenders to a counterattack. Ancient accounts emphasize surprise and restraint rather than a prolonged engagement. Where sources describe failed ambushes, they often attribute failure to loss of concealment or premature action. And archaeological evidence for ambush is a bit indirect. While weapons and fortifications survive, ambush leaves few physical traces. As a result, historians have to rely on consistency between written accounts. Where alignment does exist, confidence increases. Where it doesn't, conclusions remain cautious. The limitations of ambush were clear. It depended on secrecy and local knowledge. Once attackers adapted or secured their flanks, opportunities diminished here. Ancient commanders understood this and used ambush selectively rather than routinely. From a defensive standpoint, it represents an economical use of force. It allowed smaller or weaker defenders to impose costs disproportionate to their size. This made it especially valuable for communities defending against larger invaders. Ambush from fortified positions highlights the importance of intelligence and patience, and even terrain awareness in these ancient survival strategies. It's a mindset focused on weakening the enemy rather than confronting them directly. Number 3. Use of fire as a defensive weapon. Fire was one of the most dangerous and effective defensive tools available in the ancient world. Unlike walls or formations, it exploited fear, chaos, and physical destruction simultaneously. Ancient cities were often built largely from wood, mud brick, and thatch, making fire a constant threat. Defenders learned to weaponize this vulnerability. Written sources from Greece, Rome, and the Near East and China describe defenders igniting the siege towers, battering rams, ladders, and other assault equipment as the attackers approached the walls. Evidence does support these accounts. Burn layers found near fortifications often show patterns consistent with deliberate ignition during conflict rather than an accidental fire. Charred siege debris discovered outside the walls indicates that attackers' equipment was sometimes destroyed before it could be effectively used. One common method involved dropping burning materials like pitch-soaked wood, resin, or cloth from the walls onto siege engines below. Fire was used defensively during naval engagements too. Ancient sources describe defenders setting ships ablaze to block harbors or deny attackers access. Physical evidence for these actions is limited, but the tactic aligns with documented naval practice. Fire caused panic. It disrupted coordination and forced attackers to abandon their equipment. Ancient writers do frequently note that fire attack could halt an assault even when the walls themselves were breached. While these descriptions may emphasize the drama, the underlying effect is supported by practical considerations. The limitations of fire, too, were equally real. Wind direction, weather, and fuel availability could all undermine its effectiveness. Defenders risked igniting their own structures if the fire spread uncontrollably, and ancient accounts occasionally describe disastrous outcomes when fires turned against the defenders. Historians agree, of course, that fire was not a standalone solution. It worked best when combined with walls, elevation, and other defensive measures. Where sources disagree on events, modern analysis focuses on general patterns rather than isolated anecdotes. Its risks were fully understood by the ancient defenders. Number 2. Fortified refuge zones and inner citadels. One of the most important, yet often overlooked, ancient defensive tactics was the creation of fortified refuge zones. These were inner citadels or strongholds, designed as last resort defensive spaces. These areas allowed defenders to continue resistance even after the outer defenses failed. Ancient cities across Mesopotamia, Greece, Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and the Andes often included elevated or heavily fortified core areas, distinct from the surrounding area. These zones were typically more strongly built, better supplied, and more defensible than the outer sections. The logic here is straightforward. Rather than risking total collapse if outer walls were breached, defenders could withdraw in stages. Each withdrawal preserved fighting capacity and it forced the attackers to repeat costly assaults. Written sources confirm the practice. Ancient siege accounts frequently describe attackers capturing parts of cities while the defenders retreated to higher or more fortified positions. The recurring pattern of this supports the existence of intentional refuge planning rather than an ad hoc retreat. Even if attackers gained entry, they still faced organized resistance, and that extended sieges, it increased supply strain and sometimes forced the attackers to negotiate or withdraw. The limitations, though, were significant. Refuge zones required preparation and resources. If food or water supplies were insufficient, defenders could be trapped. Ancient accounts frequently show sieges ending due to starvation rather than direct assault. But despite the risks, the inner citadels were a rational response to a siege reality. As a defensive tactic, fortified refuge zones show strategic depth and acceptance of a staged loss rather than total defeat. Number 1. Attrition through time, endurance as a defensive strategy. The most powerful ancient defensive tactic was not a structure, a weapon, or formation. It was time itself. Attrition, forcing attackers to exhaust resources, morale, and manpower, was the foundation upon which many other defenses were built. Ancient armies were fragile logistical systems. Food, water, fodder, and pay were constant concerns. Defenders understood that simply surviving could defeat attackers without decisive battle. This strategy is documented across civilizations, and it's supported by siege records spanning thousands of years. Long sieges are among the best documented examples. Archaeological layers show repeated occupation and repair within besieged cities, which indicate sustained resistance. Written sources describe sieges lasting months or years, often ending due to attacker exhaustion rather than a military defeat. Attrition worked by compounding the problems. Disease spread in crowded camps, supply lines stretched thin, soldiers deserted or mutinied. Ancient commanders frequently abandoned sieges after realizing the cost outweighed any potential gain. But this tactic required discipline and restraint from the defenders. Avoiding unnecessary engagements, rationing supplies, and maintaining morale were critical. Ancient books often emphasized leadership and order during prolonged defense, though the details of internal organization are rarely preserved. Though attrition was not always successful, some defenders surrendered or collapsed before the attackers did. Outcomes depended on geography, resources, and political context. Ancient history provides examples of both success and failure here. What makes attrition the most important defensive tactic, though, is its universality. Walls, terrain, and weapons all served the goal. Defense was not about winning battles, it was about making conquest too costly. In the analysis of history, attrition is widely accepted as a central principle of ancient defense. It requires no speculation and aligns with every known constraint of ancient warfare. As a defensive tactic, endurance represents the ultimate expression of survival. It turned time into a weapon and patience into power.